Hello, this is part two of my discussion of how is it possible to reconcile Orthodox Christian theology when it comes to the Trinity, the Incarnation, the deity of Christ, with historical criticism and its emphasis on the historical, objective reading of texts without later presuppositions and ideas intruding anachronistically into our reading of text. Try to understand it as an original historical context. So I'm reading from this book by Dale Martin, which is written in part to offer the solution to this. And I want to share with you the solution and discuss the merits or otherwise of his proposed solution to this contradiction, because New Testament scholars overwhelmingly are Christians, they believe in Christianity, and yet their own profession, the text they study, suggest a very different kind of understanding of Jesus, God, and so on than the one they believe. And how do they reconcile? How do they live with this contradiction, if it is a contradiction? And Dale Martin, the professor from Yale, offers according to the reviewers on the back of the book, a very good, plausible solution. So I just want to share that solution with you, and you may assess it for your own use for yourselves. So I got to the bit in the passage where he is discussing Paul's views of God and Christ in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 3. I'll just read the passage or the verse. But I want you to understand, says Paul, that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. That's what Paul says. So here we have Jesus in heaven. This is after the resurrection, after the ascension. This is Paul's theology of God, if you like, his understanding of the hierarchy within the Godhead, if that's what it is. So Dale Martin says, although Paul believes Jesus is divine in some sense, he seems not to accord Jesus complete divine equality with God the Father. He can speak of Christ and God as two different persons in a hierarchical relationship. When Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:3 offers something of an equation, Christ is the head of man, man is the head of woman, God is the head of Christ, we must assume subordinate relations in each case. The parallelism doesn't work otherwise. Christ is no more equal to God than man is to Christ. So here we have our first problem. Dale Martin candidly acknowledges that Paul is not giving us the definition of the Trinity, which I mentioned in the previous video, where the three distinct persons are equal in divinity. They're not clearly here, they are subordinate. The Son, Christ rather, is subordinate to God, who is another being. Then he says the same seems to be assumed in another passage in 1 Corinthians 15:24 to 28, which I'll just read to you. So it's the same letter of Paul, and verses 24 to 28, where Paul says, then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed every ruler and every authority and power. This is he, meaning Jesus, of course. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed, is death. For God has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that this does not include the one who put all things in subjection under him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to the one who put all things in subjection under him, so that God may be all in all. So Dale Martin says the same may be assumed later in 1 Corinthians 15. God temporarily puts all things under subjection to Christ, who, after subjecting all things to himself, then puts everything again under subjection to God, including himself. Again, a very hierarchical relationship with the Son, very much subordinated to God. He continues, some texts of the New Testament do accept the divinity of Jesus, but they seem not to all agree about when Jesus became divine. As I've said a number of times, in the ancient world, in Judaism and in the Greco-Roman world, there was a spectrum of beliefs about the divinity. Some people were, there was obviously God himself, the most high Lord, the Yahweh, but other beings could also be called divine in some sense. The king in Psalm 45 is addressed as God. Melchizedek is also seen as a divine figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the son of Hezekiah in Isaiah is also called God. That's in Isaiah 9:6, and so on and so on. There are many examples. So some early Christians believe that Jesus was a mere human at his birth, but that he was adopted as God's son sometime later. According to what may be the original reading of Luke 3:22, so yes, this is Luke believing this, 3:22, you are my son, the beloved, today I have begotten you. Jesus is begotten by God at his baptism. According to some other early Christians, apparently, Jesus became God's son only at his resurrection, as reflected in passages in Acts. In one sermon delivered by Peter in Acts, God made Jesus Lord and Messiah at some point, Acts 2:36. So Jesus wasn't Lord or Messiah before God, another being, made Jesus Lord and Messiah at that particular point, Acts 2:36. In a later sermon of Paul in Acts, one statement suggests that God adopted Jesus as his son at the resurrection. This is Acts 13:32-33. Paul himself seems to betray knowledge of such a Christology in one of his letters. In Romans chapter 1 verse 4, Paul says that God designated Jesus as the Son of God by resurrection from the dead. The most normal reading of the Greek would be that God made Jesus his son by means of the resurrection. So Jesus wasn't God's son in entire life until the resurrection, when God made him that way. Made him his son by means of resurrection, in the way a priest or pope or other authority made someone a king or queen at the time of the declaration or coronation. So this might be Paul's understanding in Romans 1. That this terminology is recited by Paul is significant, since Paul himself seems to believe that Jesus was God's son already in some pre-existent state, Philippians 2:5-11. I take it that Paul is here quoting a formula about Christ he had encountered elsewhere. So he's quoting an earlier creedal belief about Jesus. At any rate, one can cite New Testament texts that, on their surface, on their face, do not reach a very orthodox Christology, and certainly not Trinitarian. Certainly not Trinitarian, as the passages, and there are many others he's just cited. And here we come to the paragraph which is Dale Martin's solution to this paradox, this contradiction, apparently, between his own personal beliefs in Jesus' deity and everything he's just said about the historical meaning of these texts in Paul and the Gospels. And here we go. It will be my contention in this chapter, however, that we need not become bad historians in order to be good theologians. Even if the New Testament authors were not familiar with the doctrine of the Trinity as it became defined in the great creeds and councils, we may take the liberty of reading the New Testament theologically rather than historically as teaching Trinitarian theology. And he spends the rest of the chapter illustrating how to do that. So he says, even if the New Testament authors were not familiar with the doctrine of the Trinity, we may take the liberty, he says, of reading the New Testament in a Christian way, theologically, he says, in terms of later Christian beliefs, rather than historically, in other words, in terms of the actual historical teaching of these texts, as teaching Trinitarian theology. So there we have it. Are you as impressed with this as I was when I first came across this chapter? Okay. So how do you reconcile, how do you square the circle? You take liberties with the text. It doesn't say Jesus, it doesn't teach the Trinity, but you read into those passages Trinitarian theology, and that's how you do it. And he goes through some passages which in their historical context, in other words, what was meant by the authors, as far as we can tell, in their first century context, did not teach Trinitarian theology, did not teach Jesus was God, but we read them theologically to mean that they did teach that. Now, this is called in the trade eisegesis, meaning you read something into a text, rather than exegesis, which is the historical critical method of reading, trying to uncover as best we can the historical meaning and the author's meaning of a text. So this is the great solution. You basically read stuff into, you read your later Christian theology into earlier texts, as if those earlier texts were saying something that they were not saying. You practice anachronism. So when Jesus is portrayed, well, I'm not going to go, this is too much to go into in one video, but I want to share with you the great solution and how personally I was disappointed by this, because I expected something slightly more creditable and morally meritorious than simply changing the texts to make them what we want them to believe today. That's not, in my view, honest. It lacks integrity. It's not taking the Bible seriously. It's imposing our own later ideas, which are quite different, onto the Bible to make it say, shall we say, torture it into saying what we want it to say. So we are hearing our own thoughts echo back to us. We're not really attending to what Paul says or Matthew, Mark and Luke. We're hearing our own thoughts read back to us through this echo that we give it. I'm disappointed in this great professor at Yale for offering this as solution. We may take the liberty, he says, of reading the New Testament, reading into the New Testament, later Christian doctrine, and that's how you save your Orthodox Christian faith. Sorry to be so judgmental, but I expected more from Dale Martin than that. But there you have it. That is how you reconcile traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs about the Trinity, about the Incarnation, about the deity of Jesus, about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being equal. That's how you reconcile those beliefs with the Christian scriptures. And you basically read your views into it and say, lo, the Bible is orthodox. But the Bible isn't orthodox. It doesn't say what you want it to say. We must be honest and take our texts as they stand. And they lead inevitably into a very different kind of belief about Jesus. It means, interestingly, that people like Arius, the great heretic of the 4th century, Arianism, is much closer to the teaching of the New Testament than Athanasius's beliefs about the Trinity. It means that those who were scorned and oppressed and kicked out, excommunicated from the church for so-called heresy, like Arius and many others like him, were actually closer to the truth of Jesus, about Jesus, than those who, by fair means and foul, came to dominate the church's discourse on theology. Anyway, that's my view. Till next time.